The apartment is quiet now. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that hums. A refrigerator buzzing in the dark kitchen, a clock ticking too loud from the hallway, rain touching the window like fingertips trying not to wake somebody. And in the middle of it, someone sitting on the edge of a bed, staring at a phone that hasn't lit up in hours. You know that feeling. Not anger, not heartbreak, something stranger. It's the moment an empath begins disappearing emotionally before they disappear physically. Because most people think empaths leave dramatically. Loud arguments, final speeches, doors slamming shut. But real empaths? The deeply feeling ones? They leave in silence first. They stop reaching, stop explaining, stop begging to be understood. And one day they realize the loneliness they feel around certain people is heavier than the loneliness of being alone. That's the part nobody talks about. An empath can survive solitude. What destroys them is emotional contamination. Being around people who slowly make them question their own nervous system, their own kindness, their own reality. And there are three specific things that make an empath retreat from the world so deeply. They begin preferring isolation over connection itself. Not because they hate people, but because their soul becomes exhausted from translating pain nobody else notices. Tonight we're going deeper into that hidden psychology, into the private emotional injuries empaths rarely confess out loud. Because if you've ever wondered why some of the kindest people suddenly vanish, why they stop calling, why they choose empty rooms over crowded love, you're about to understand something most people never will. The first thing that makes an empath choose loneliness over connection is when they realize their emotional safety is being punished instead of protected. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. Empaths know this exhaustion intimately. It happens when you spend too much time around people who only respect emotions they personally understand. At first, the empath adapts. That's what they do. They adjust their tone, shrink their reactions, translate their feelings into softer language so nobody feels uncomfortable. They become emotionally bilingual, fluent in their own pain and everybody else's. But eventually something devastating begins to happen internally. The empath notices that every honest emotion they express gets treated like an inconvenience instead of a reality. If they speak softly about something hurting them, they're called sensitive. If they withdraw to protect their energy, they're accused of being distant. If they explain the emotional tension they feel in a room, people laugh it off because nobody else can see it. And slowly, the empath begins carrying a terrible, invisible burden, the burden of feeling deeply in a world that rewards emotional numbness. You've probably seen this happen without realizing it. An empath enters a room smiling, warm, present, emotionally available. But by the end of the night, they look drained in a way that has nothing to do with conversation. Because empaths don't just hear words, they absorb atmospheres. They notice the irritation hidden behind fake laughter, the resentment buried underneath politeness, the sadness someone disguises with sarcasm. And the hardest part? Most empaths spend years believing it's their responsibility to emotionally rescue everyone they can feel. That becomes their prison. They become caretakers of moods that were never theirs to carry. And people get addicted to this. They become comfortable receiving emotional understanding from the empath while giving almost none in return. That imbalance slowly becomes traumatic. Not dramatic, traumatic. Because when someone constantly invalidates your emotional instincts, your nervous system starts living in confusion. You begin questioning your own intuition. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I'm imagining the tension. But deep down, your body knows. Your body always knows. That strange heaviness you feel after talking to certain people, that exhaustion after being around constant criticism, hidden hostility, emotional unpredictability, that's not weakness. That's your nervous system sounding an alarm your mind keeps trying to silence. And eventually, the empath reaches a terrifying realization. I feel more peace alone than I do around the people who claim to love me. That sentence changes everything. Because once an empath discovers the emotional safety of solitude, they stop tolerating performative connection. They stop fighting for seats at tables where their spirit leaves starving. And this is where people misunderstand them completely. The empath isn't isolating because they think they're better than others. They're isolating because they can no longer survive environments where their emotional reality is constantly denied. Imagine touching a hot stove every day while people around you insist it isn't burning you. That's what emotional invalidation feels like to an empath. Especially because empaths already question themselves more than anyone realizes. They replay conversations for hours, analyze facial expressions, overstudy silence, search for hidden meanings inside ordinary moments, not because they're weak, because they're hyper-aware. And hyper-awareness becomes unbearable when surrounded by people who weaponize confusion. Some people only feel powerful when the empath feels unstable, so they minimize their emotions, mock their sensitivity, call them too much whenever they express hurt. But what they don't understand is this: every time an empath suppresses their emotional truth to keep peace, they lose another piece of their desire to stay connected, until eventually, the quiet starts feeling safer than love itself. And when that happens, the empath doesn't just physically withdraw. They begin emotionally disappearing from places they once begged to belong in. But the second reason empaths choose solitude over connection runs even deeper than invalidation, because it changes the way they see trust entirely. An empath can forgive almost anything except emotional dishonesty. Not mistakes, not flaws, not brokenness, dishonesty. Because empaths are not listening to your words the way most people do. They're listening to the fracture between your words and your energy. That's why lying to an empath feels different than lying to someone else. Most people hear the sentence. The empath hears the hesitation before it, the shift in eye contact, the nervous smile that arrives half a second too late, the emotional static hiding underneath ordinary conversation. And here's the painful part. Empaths often notice deception long before they're emotionally ready to accept it. So instead of confronting it immediately, they begin doing something dangerous. They start abandoning themselves to preserve the connection. They pretend not to notice the inconsistency, pretend not to feel the manipulation, pretend not to recognize the subtle emotional cruelty hiding inside charm. Because empaths don't just fear losing people, they fear being right about people. There's a huge difference. Being right means accepting that the person they trusted emotionally is not emotionally safe. And that realization can feel like mourning someone who's still standing in front of you. So the empath waits. They over-explain the other person's behavior, give endless benefit of the doubt, search for alternate meanings because the truth hurts too much to hold directly. But every ignored instinct leaves a scar. Every time the empath betrays their own intuition to maintain closeness, something inside them weakens. And eventually, their nervous system changes. They become quieter, more observant, less emotionally available. Not because they stopped caring, because they learned caring without safety becomes self-destruction. This is the hidden transformation nobody sees. People think empaths suddenly become cold, but empaths rarely become cold. They become careful. There's a sadness in realizing your kindness made you attractive to emotionally hungry people. People who loved being understood, but never intended to understand you back. People who treated the empath like emotional oxygen while slowly suffocating them in return. And the empath notices patterns other people miss. They notice how certain people only become affectionate after causing pain. How apologies arrive without changed behavior. How some conversations leave behind emotional bruises even when no harsh words were spoken. Because emotional manipulation is often quiet. It lives in subtle contradictions. In being made to feel guilty for expressing needs. In being punished with withdrawal whenever honesty appears. In feeling emotionally inspected instead of emotionally held. Empaths feel this immediately. Not intellectually, physically. Their chest tightens. Their appetite changes. Their sleep becomes restless. Their body begins anticipating emotional impact before the mind fully understands why. That's why so many empaths eventually disappear from social circles, relationships, even family dynamics that once mattered deeply to them. Not because they stopped loving people, because their body could no longer survive constant emotional misalignment. And once an empath discovers how peaceful life becomes without emotional deception, solitude becomes sacred. Think about that. Most people view being alone as emptiness. An empath often experiences it as recovery. No emotional guessing games. No hidden hostility buried beneath politeness. No exhausting need to monitor the emotional temperature of everyone in the room. Just silence, breathing, space. For the first time in a long time, their nervous system unclenches. And suddenly they realize something heartbreaking. They were never afraid of being alone. They were afraid of feeling alone beside people who claimed to care. That realization changes the entire architecture of trust. Because after enough emotional betrayal, empaths stop looking for attention. They start looking for consistency. They no longer care about charisma, or intensity, or beautiful words spoken at midnight. They care about emotional congruence. Does your energy match your language? Does your behavior match your promises? Does your presence feel safe when nothing exciting is happening? Most people underestimate how deeply empaths study this. Because empaths understand something painful about human nature. A person's true character is rarely revealed in how they love you during emotional highs. It's revealed in how they handle your vulnerability when it becomes inconvenient. And once an empath experiences enough emotional inconsistency, something irreversible happens inside them. They stop chasing closeness. They begin protecting peace. But the third reason empaths begin choosing isolation over connection is the one that hurts the deepest, because it rarely begins with strangers. The deepest wounds empaths carry are almost never created by enemies. They are created by people they once relaxed around completely. Family, close friends, partners, the people whose presence once felt like home. That's what makes it devastating. Because when an empath opens their inner world to someone, they do it carefully, slowly, like someone handing another person the map to a hidden city. Empaths do not trust easily the way people assume they do. They may connect easily, comfort easily, understand easily, but true emotional exposure? That is rare. And when someone finally earns it, the empath begins lowering defenses they've spent years building. They stop scanning every sentence, stop emotionally preparing for disappointment, stop expecting abandonment hiding behind affection. For a little while, they breathe differently around that person. Lighter. Safer. But if that safety is eventually violated, the damage reaches places ordinary heartbreak cannot touch. Because betrayal affects empaths in layers. First comes the pain itself. Then comes the far more dangerous wound, the destruction of emotional certainty. Now the empath no longer knows when it's safe to fully relax around anyone. And this changes everything. You'll notice it in subtle ways. They hesitate before replying honestly. They keep parts of themselves hidden, even during intimate conversations. They begin emotionally editing their personality depending on who they're around. Not because they're fake, because they learned authenticity can become ammunition in the wrong hands. Somebody once took their softness and used it against them. Used private fears during arguments, turned vulnerability into leverage, turned emotional openness into something unsafe. That kind of experience doesn't just hurt an empath, it rewires them. And the terrifying part is, most people never notice the exact moment it happens. The empath still smiles, still listens, still comforts others. But internally, a door has closed. A quiet internal sentence forms. I will never let someone reach that part of me again. That sentence creates emotional isolation long before physical isolation begins. This is why many empaths start preferring distance even when they crave connection, because closeness now feels psychologically expensive. Every new relationship carries unconscious risk. Will this person misunderstand me too? Will they eventually use my sensitivity against me? Will I become emotionally responsible for another person who never truly sees me? And over time, the empath develops a strange contradiction. They become incredibly good at making others feel emotionally safe, while secretly feeling unsafe almost everywhere themselves. That contradiction is exhausting. Imagine constantly being the emotional shelter for others while internally standing in the rain. That's the private life of many empaths. People come to them for comfort because empaths know how to hold pain gently, how to listen without judgment, how to notice emotional details others overlook. But very few people ask the empath one important question. Who holds you? Not who admires you, not who desires you, not who needs you, Who emotionally protects you? Because empaths are often loved for what they give, not for what they are. And eventually they notice this pattern with painful clarity. People adore their empathy, until that empathy requires reciprocity, until the empath has needs too, boundaries too, emotional exhaustion too. That's when disappointment begins settling into the nervous system like cold weather. Not dramatic disappointment, quiet disappointment. The kind that accumulates slowly over years. The kind born from realizing you are deeply understood by almost no one, despite spending your life understanding everybody else. That loneliness is difficult to describe. You can sit in a crowded room and feel it. Lie beside someone you love and feel it. Answer messages all day and still feel emotionally untouched. Because the empath isn't starving for attention. They're starving for resonance. For someone whose presence doesn't feel emotionally extractive. Someone who doesn't force them to shrink, overperform, or emotionally translate themselves constantly. And when they fail to find that, solitude starts becoming more than preference. It becomes protection. Protection from emotional labor without reciprocity. Protection from being psychologically consumed by people who mistake empathy for infinite endurance. Because here's the truth most empaths eventually learn too late. Just because you can understand someone's pain does not mean you are meant to carry it. That realization changes the way they love forever. Suddenly they stop over-explaining themselves, stop chasing people emotionally unavailable to them, stop forcing closeness where peace keeps disappearing. And to outsiders, it looks like the empath has become distant from humanity itself. But internally, they are simply trying to remember what their own emotional voice sounds like underneath everybody else's noise. And once an empath reaches that stage, there is only one final thing that determines whether they return to connection or disappear into solitude completely. In the end, empaths do not leave because they stop loving people. They leave because they finally understand the difference between love and emotional survival. That realization arrives quietly, not during a dramatic breakup, not after some explosive betrayal. Usually it happens in an ordinary moment. A conversation that leaves them feeling strangely hollow. A gathering where they laugh with everyone else but feel emotionally invisible the entire time. A late night where they sit alone afterward, staring at the ceiling, realizing they feel safer in silence than they did around people all evening. That's the turning point. Because empaths spend most of their lives believing connection is something they must earn through understanding. If they listen enough, forgive enough, love deeply enough, maybe they'll finally receive the same emotional care in return. But many never do. Instead, they become emotional homes for people who were never capable of being homes for them. And after years of this imbalance, something inside the empath begins collapsing from exhaustion. Not their kindness, their hope. Hope that one day someone will notice the weight they carry without being asked. Hope that someone will speak to their nervous system gently instead of forcing it into constant defense. Hope that they can exist around others without slowly abandoning themselves in the process. That's why solitude becomes seductive to empaths. Because solitude does not demand emotional self-betrayal. In solitude, they no longer have to explain why certain energies affect them. No longer have to apologize for feeling too much. No longer have to compress their emotional depth into language shallow enough for emotionally unavailable people to tolerate. For the first time, they can hear themselves again. Their own thoughts, their own rhythms, their own emotional intuition without interruption. And what they often discover is heartbreaking. They were never too sensitive. They were surrounded by people disconnected from sensitivity entirely. That changes the empath forever. Because once someone experiences the peace of emotional alignment, they become unwilling to return to environments that require psychological self-erasure. This is why some empaths suddenly become extremely selective about who enters their life. Not arrogant, not cold, intentional. They start paying attention to how their body responds around people. Can they relax around you? Can they speak honestly without fear of punishment? Can they exist without feeling emotionally consumed? Empaths understand something most people ignore. Your nervous system keeps score even when your mouth says, "I'm fine." And eventually the empath stops prioritizing chemistry over safety. That's a massive transformation. Because chemistry can feel intoxicating, familiar, immediate. But emotional safety? That feels calm, predictable, consistent, quiet. And many empaths were conditioned to mistake chaos for connection. So when peace finally enters their life, it almost feels suspicious at first. No manipulation, no emotional guessing games, no walking on invisible glass trying not to trigger someone else's instability. Just honesty, just presence, just emotional steadiness. That is what finally brings an empath back out of isolation. Not charm, not intensity, not grand declarations. Safety. The kind that allows their nervous system to soften instead of brace itself constantly. Because despite everything, empaths never truly stop wanting connection. They stop wanting connection that costs them their identity. There's a difference, a profound difference. And maybe that's the hidden tragedy behind so many isolated empaths walking through the world right now. People assume they withdrew because they dislike humanity, but many of them withdrew because they loved too hard in places that only knew how to consume softness, not protect it. So now they sit quietly in dim apartments, drive alone at night with music playing softly through the speakers, take long walks without answering messages. Not because they want to disappear forever, but because they are trying to remember how to exist without emotional pain becoming their permanent atmosphere. And if you are one of those people, one of those silent feelers carrying invisible exhaustion, there's something you need to understand before this night ends. The right connection will never ask you to betray your nervous system in exchange for belonging. The right connection will not make peace feel lonely. It will make loneliness feel unnecessary.